The UAP Herald Case File 015, The Debunking. The summer of 1952. Over the city of Washington, D.C., on 2 July weekends running, radar screens light up with targets nobody can explain. Objects over the White House, objects over the Capitol. Air traffic controllers watch them pace and turn in ways no airplane should. Fighter jets scramble out of Delaware. The objects vanish when the jets arrive and come back when they leave on empty tanks. The story runs on the front page of every newspaper in the country. And inside the government, something quieter and far more consequential begins to move. Not at the Air Force, at the Central Intelligence Agency. Because to the men who read intelligence for a living, the frightening thing in the summer of 1952 was not the lights, it was the panic. Thousands of reports were flooding the same military channels that would carry the warning of a Soviet attack. And in a year when the Cold War could turn hot in an afternoon, a sky full of flying saucers looked like a weapon the enemy could use. Not a spacecraft, a stampede. So the CIA did what intelligence agencies do. It convened a panel. 5 of the most eminent scientists in America, physicists, an astronomer, the men who had built the radar and split the atom, brought quietly into a room in Washington for 5 days in January 1953. They read the best cases the Air Force had. They watched the films, and then they wrote a report that would shape what the United States government said about UFOs for the next 20 years. Their conclusion was not that the sources were real. It was that the public's belief in them was dangerous and had to be reduced, on purpose, by the government. Their word for it, in the file, is a word you would not expect a committee of Nobel-caliber scientists to write down: debunking. Tonight, a real declassified CIA file, the report of the Robertson Panel, and the memo that shows what it did. The meeting that taught America to laugh at the sky. Because here is the part nobody tells you. The cover-up was real, but what it was covering up was not what you think. Start, as we always do, with the object in your hand, because here, the document is the case. There is no wreckage and no body. There is a folder, a scanned CIA records folder, 42 pages, and it is one of the most important pieces of paper in the entire history of the American UFO question. Look at the cover, because provenance is the whole game. The folder tab reads HS/HC 475 Flying Objects. The record citation, Record Group 263, that is the CIA's own record group at the National Archives, CIAE, Folder 90. Most pages carry a red stamp, Secret, Security Information, with the classification crossed out later in blue pencil, and many carry a second block that tells you exactly how it came into daylight.
This document has been approved for release through the Historical Review Program of the Central Intelligence Agency. Date 7 June 1991. A separate stamp reads, "The CIA has no objection to the declassification of this document." And on a later page, a National Archives block, Declassified, Authority NND 917075, NARA, dated the 31st of July, 1997.
So this is not a leak, and it is not new. This file was declassified more than 30 years ago, published for decades through the CIA's reading room and by Open Archives Online, and then released again alongside the rest of the government's UFO holdings in the 2026 war.gov disclosure. That long, public, checkable history is a feature, not a weakness. You do not have to take our word for a syllable of it. You can pull the same pages we did. Now, what is actually inside the folder? Because it is not one document, it is a stack. There is a chain of transmittal letters, March and April 1953, sending the report out to other agencies. There is the report itself, 4 pages, dated the 17th of January 1953, with the panel's formal conclusions and signatures. There is tab B, a list of the evidence the panel was shown. There is tab C, the roster of who was in the room. There is a long narrative account of the meetings, written by an associate member named Frederick Durant. And at the back, tucked in, earlier memos from October and November 1952, the paper trail of how the CIA talked itself into calling the meeting at all. And here is the first thing the file does that a cover-up story does not expect. It admits on its own face that it is incomplete. 2 documents have been physically pulled out of the folder and replaced with pink slips.
Document number 400165, dated the 16th of February, 1953, 6 pages, a memo. Document number 400169, dated the 17th of January, 1953, 25 pages, a report and attached memos. Each replaced by a notice reading, "This item has been withdrawn because it contains security classified information or otherwise restricted information."
Hold on to those 2 slips, 31 pages still withheld from a file that is otherwise released, including a 25-page report attached to the very report we can read. We will come back to what might be behind them, and just as important, what almost certainly is not. For now, log it honestly. The folder you are about to hear read out is real, it is verified, and it is not the whole thing. That is the document. The question is why the most powerful intelligence agency on Earth ever opened it. To understand the Robertson Panel, you have to understand the year that produced it. Because 1952 was the single biggest UFO year in American history, and it terrified the wrong people for the wrong reason. Reports were not trickling in, they were flooding. By the CIA's own count that autumn, there had been roughly 1,500 reported sightings of flying saucers since 1947, and the pace in 1952 dwarfed everything before it. And then came Washington. Over 2 weekends in July, unidentified targets appeared on radar over the nation's capital. Jets were scrambled, and the story detonated across the front pages. To the public, it looked like an invasion. To the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, it looked like something else, a national security problem that had nothing to do with whether the sources were real. Read the memos in the back of the folder, and you can watch the fear take its actual shape.
13 October 1952. From the Office of Scientific Intelligence, of some 1,500 reported sightings of flying saucers, an explanation has been provided on all but 20%. Its review of existing information does not lead to the conclusion that the saucers are USSR created or controlled.
Read that twice, because it quietly demolishes the simplest version of the cover-up story. The CIA's own assessment in October 1952 was that the saucers were not Russian, not secret Soviet aircraft, and by strong implication, not a foreign weapon at all. So if they were not the enemies, what was the emergency? The same memo says it out loud, and it is a sentence that should stop you.
It is far too early, in view of the present state of our knowledge regarding flying saucers, for psychological warfare planners to start planning how the United States might use US flying saucers against the enemy.
Sit with that. The concern in the room was not defending against saucers. It was, at least in part, whether the saucer phenomenon itself, the belief, the panic, the reporting, could be turned into a weapon, by us against them, or far more worryingly, by them against us. Because here is the scenario that actually kept these men up at night. Imagine the Soviets time an attack to a wave of saucer reports. The radar scopes fill with junk. The phone lines to air defense clog, with civilians calling in lights. and the one real formation of Soviet bombers slips through the noise because nobody can tell the signal from the flying saucers. That is the threat the CIA saw, not little green men, a country so worked up about the sky that it could be blinded at the decisive moment. The earlier memos in the folder talk about exactly this: radar phantoms, clogged channels, the machinery of national defense jammed by its own frightened citizens. So the Office of Scientific Intelligence went to the Director of Central Intelligence and, in December 1952, recommended that a panel of outside scientists be convened to look at the hard evidence and settle the question. Not is it real, but is it a threat? And what do we do about the panic? The man who pushed hardest for it was the Assistant Director of Scientific Intelligence, Dr. H. Marshall Chadwell. And in the middle of January 1953, 5 scientists came quietly to Washington to give him his answer. The panel met for 5 days, the 14th through the 18th of January 1953, in Washington, convened by the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence. And the roster, tab C of the folder, is the reason this report carried the weight it did. These were not cranks or debunkers for hire. They were, in 1953, close to the most serious scientific firepower the United States could put in one room. Read the names as the file lists them, with their fields.
Chairman, Dr. H.P. Robertson, California Institute of Technology, Physics, Weapon Systems. Dr. Luis W. Alvarez, University of California, Physics, Radar. Dr. Lloyd V. Berkner, Associated Universities, Geophysics. Dr. Samuel Goudsmit, Brookhaven National Laboratories, Atomic Structure, Statistical Problems. Dr. Thornton Page, Johns Hopkins, Astronomy, Astrophysics. As associate members, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, Ohio State, Astronomy, and Mr. Frederick C. Durant, Rockets and Guided Missiles.
Understand who you just heard. Robertson, the chair, was a Caltech physicist and a top government weapons advisor. Lloyd Berkner was a giant of American geophysics. Samuel Goudsmit was the physicist who had led Allied intelligence's hunt for the Nazi atomic bomb. And Luis Alvarez, the radar man, would go on, 15 years later, to win the 1968 Nobel Prize in Physics. These were the people the government sent for when it needed the truth, not a headline. 2 of the associate names matter for a different reason. Frederick Durant would write the long narrative account of the meeting, the fly-on-the-wall record we are about to lean on. And J. Allen Hynek, the young astronomer in the room, was the Air Force's own UFO consultant, the man who decades later would break with the debunkers, coin the phrase close encounters, and become the most famous UFO scientist alive. In January 1953, he was mostly a junior voice at the table. So what did the government put in front of these men? Tab B lists the evidence, and it is a tour of the whole secret American UFO effort as it stood in 1953.
Progress reports of Project Grudge and Project Blue Book, the Air Force study. Project Stork, a statistical report on sightings, 1947 through 52, run at Battelle. Project Twinkle, the investigation of the green fireballs. The proposed Project Pounce out of Kirtland. Charts plotting the geographic location of unexplained sightings, and motion picture films.
Everything the Air Force had, handed to 5 civilian scientists to judge in 5 days, and the panel listened to the men who ran it too, including Captain Edward Ruppelt, the head of the Air Force's Aerial Phenomena Branch, the officer who actually ran Blue Book, and who, of all the government's UFO men, took the subject the most seriously. Remember Ruppelt. What happens to him after this meeting is part of the story. But the heart of those 5 days was not the paperwork. It was 2 strips of film and a fight over what they showed. If the Robertson Panel had a centerpiece, it was a home movie shot in Utah. On the 2nd of July, 1952, the same explosive summer, a Navy chief photographer named Delbert Newhouse was driving near Tremonton, Utah, with his family when they saw a cluster of bright objects in the daytime sky. Newhouse grabbed his camera and shot roughly a minute of color film, about 1,600 frames, of gleaming dots, milling and wheeling overhead. It went to the Air Force and then to the Navy's Photo Interpretation Laboratory at Anacostia, whose analysts studied it frame by frame, and the Navy Lab's conclusion is the reason this case landed in front of the panel.
It was the opinion of the PIL representatives that the objects cited were not birds, balloons, or aircraft, were not reflections, because there was no blinking while passing through 60 degrees of arc, and were therefore self-luminous.
Self-luminous. The Navy's own photo analysts, having measured the light on the film, concluded these things made their own light, that they were not birds, not balloons, not airplanes, and not sunlight glinting off anything. That is a United States military laboratory on the record, unable to explain the best film the government had, and the Robertson Panel, the 5 wise men, took that conclusion apart. They listed objection after objection. The file records 11 of them, lettered A through K. And you should hear the reasoning, because this is the exact moment the machine of official skepticism switches on.
A semi-spherical object can readily produce a reflection of sunlight without blinking through 60 degrees of arc travel. The apparent motions, sizes, and brightnesses of the objects were considered strongly to suggest birds. The PIL description of the objects as circular, bluish-white would be expected in cases of specular reflection of sunlight from convex surfaces, as from a gull, and the light intensity analysis was made from a duplicate, not the original film. The original had a much lighter background.
Birds. The panel's answer to the Navy laboratory was, in essence, you are looking at seagulls, their white bodies flaring in the bright Utah sun. And to their credit, they did not simply assert it. They proposed tests. Photograph flocks of birds under the same conditions, consult ornithologists on how gull plumage reflects light, calculate the G-forces the object's tracks would require. That is real scientific skepticism, and we will not sneer at it, but be honest about what happened in that room, because it cuts both ways. A military photo lab that measured the film said self-luminous, not birds. A panel of physicists who looked at it for part of an afternoon said probably birds. Both cannot be right, and the file does not resolve it. The panel itself was divided, some accepting the birds, some finding the motion wrong for birds. To this day, the Tremonton film is officially unexplained, and the disagreement you just heard is on the record, unsettled 70 years later. The panel did the same to the other film they were shown, from Great Falls, Montana, August 1950, 2 bright objects crossing the sky. Probably reflections of aircraft known to be in the area they judged. And that pattern, take the best evidence, find a mundane candidate, and extend the confidence outward, is the whole method. The report says so, almost proudly.
Reasonable explanations could be suggested for most sightings, and, by deduction and scientific method, it could be induced, given additional data, that other cases might be explained in a similar manner.
Given additional data. In other words, we explained the ones we could, and we are confident the rest would fall the same way if only we had more to go on. That is a defensible scientific instinct. It is also precisely an assumption, and the panel built its entire recommendation on top of it. But there is one line in the file from the chairman himself that is the most honest thing in the whole folder and the most important. Dr. Robertson comparing the UFO problem to a wartime intelligence operation he had worked on, hunting German V weapons.
In this 1943-44 intelligence operation, there was excellent intelligence, and by June 1944, there was material evidence of the existence of hardware obtained from crashed vehicles in Sweden. The absence of any hardware resulting from unexplained UFO sightings lends a will-o'-the-wisp nature to the attic problem.
There it is, the absence of any hardware. In 1953, the chairman of the most serious UFO panel the American government ever convened put his finger on the thing that is still true today. There is no wreckage, no debris, no craft on a table. When they hunted German rockets, they had recovered pieces by June of '44. With the sources, nothing solid, ever in hand. A will-o'-the-wisp. Remember that line when we get to what this panel was and was not hiding. On the 17th of January, 1953, the 5 scientists signed their report. It is 4 pages, and its formal conclusion is exactly what Chadwell had hoped for.
The evidence presented on unidentified flying objects shows no indication that these phenomena constitute a direct physical threat to national security. We firmly believe that there is no residuum of cases which indicates phenomena which are attributable to foreign artifacts capable of hostile acts, and that there is no evidence that the phenomena indicate a need for the revision of current scientific concepts.
No threat, no foreign weapon, no new physics. If the report had stopped there, it would be a footnote, but it did not stop there. And the second finding is the one that changed the country's relationship with the sky. Because having decided the sources were harmless, the panel decided that the belief in them was not.
The continued emphasis on the reporting of these phenomena does, in these parlous times, result in a threat to the orderly functioning of the protective organs of the body politic. We cite as examples the overloading of emergency reporting channels and the cultivation of a morbid national psychology in which skillful hostile propaganda could induce hysterical behavior and harmful distrust of duly constituted authority.
A morbid national psychology. That is the enemy the panel actually named, not the saucer, but the public's fascination with it, which a clever adversary could inflame into hysteria and distrust of the government. And so, 5 scientists made a recommendation that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with managing what a nation was allowed to believe.
That the national security agencies take immediate steps to strip the unidentified flying objects of the special status they have been given and the aura of mystery they have unfortunately acquired.
Strip them of the aura of mystery, on purpose. And the folder is specific about how. The program, Durant's narrative says, was to have 2 major aims. He writes the second one in quotation marks, because even to them, it was a strange word to put in a government report.
The panel's concept of a broad educational program integrating efforts of all concerned agencies was that it should have 2 major aims: training and, quote, debunking.
Training and debunking. Training to teach people to recognize the planet Venus, a weather balloon, a temperature inversion on a radar scope, the mundane things they were mistaking for sources. And debunking, to actively drain the subject of its mystery, its glamour, its pull on the public mind. And when the scientists brainstormed how to deliver a mass debunking campaign to the American people, they reached, quite literally, for the country's storytellers.
The Jam Handy Company, which made World War II training films, was suggested, as well as Walt Disney Incorporated animated cartoons. Dr. Berkner suggested the Navy's Special Devices Center, and the psychologist Hadley Cantrell, who had studied the panic around the 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcast, was named as a consultant.
Walt Disney. The panel that decided flying saucers were seagulls, and Sunlight proposed enlisting Walt Disney to help teach America to stop believing in them, and reached for the man who had literally written the book on mass panic to help engineer the calm. Whether a single Disney cartoon was ever made is not in this file, and we will not claim it was. What is in the file is the intent, in black and white, a deliberate, government-coordinated program to reshape public belief. And then comes the darkest line in the whole folder, the one that turns a public relations plan into something colder. Because the panel did not just want to educate the public, it wanted to keep an eye on the citizens who would not be educated.
It was believed that such organizations should be watched because of their potentially great influence on mass thinking if widespread sightings should occur. The apparent irresponsibility in the possible use of such groups for subversive purposes should be kept in mind.
Such organizations. The panel named two of them, the Civilian Flying Saucer Investigators in Los Angeles and the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization in Wisconsin. Ordinary hobbyist UFO clubs, Americans writing to each other about lights in the sky, and a CIA-convened panel of the nation's top scientists wrote in 1953 that such groups should be watched for their influence on mass thinking and for their possible use for subversive purposes. That is the sentence the conspiracy theorists were right about. It is not a rumor. It is in the file, in the government's own words. What the file does not say, and we have to be just as clear about this, is whether that recommendation was ever acted on or led to any actual surveillance. The document recommends watching. It does not record any watching. We hold it exactly there. So the skeptic's corner, where we hand the microphone honestly to the other side, because credibility is the only thing this channel actually sells. And here the skeptic and the believer have swapped their usual seats. So let us take the file apart with a cold eye, because on this case, the most seductive reading is also the wrong one.
You want to call this a cover-up? Fine. But say what it covered up and be precise. Read the file. There is no recovered craft in it. No body, no debris on a table. The CIA's own memo says the sources were not even Russian. The chairman himself calls the whole thing a will-o'-the-wisp, precisely because there is no hardware. What the Robertson Panel concealed was not a spaceship. It was a public relations judgment that the public was getting too excited about nothing and that the excitement itself was a Cold War vulnerability. The cover-up, such as it was a cover-up of the government's own contempt for the subject and its willingness to manage what you believed. That is real, and it is bad enough. Do not inflate it into a hangar full of sources because the document you are quoting says the opposite.
That is the single most important correction in this entire episode, and I will not soften it. The Robertson Panel is Exhibit A, that the government ran a deliberate debunking campaign, and Exhibit A at the very same time that the reason was not a hidden craft. Both are true. Keep going.
Then the science, because the panel was not wrong about most of it. The overwhelming majority of UFO reports genuinely are misidentifications. Planets, balloons, aircraft, meteors, temperature inversions on radar. That is not propaganda. It is measurably true then and now. The Air Force really was drowning in reports. The channels really could clog. A panic really could be exploited by an enemy. Every premise the panel started from was reasonable, and even the Tremonton film, The Crown Jewel, has a mundane candidate. Bright birds in bright sun is not a crazy explanation. It might even be the right one.
All fair. The panel's diagnosis of the 90+% was sound. Where the honest critique bites is not the science, it is the leap. Add the rest of the ledger, coldly.
The leap is this. Having explained the cases they could, they assumed the remainder would fall the same way, given additional data they did not have. They studied the best film for part of an afternoon and overruled the Navy laboratory that had measured it for weeks. And then they used a scientific finding, no threat, to justify an unscientific act, a campaign to reduce public curiosity, and a suggestion to watch the citizens who kept it up. Scientists are qualified to say what the evidence shows. They are not, by virtue of a physics degree, qualified to decide how much wonder the public should be permitted. That is the overreach, not a hidden saucer, but scientists volunteering to manage belief.
And yet the skeptic does not get to keep the whole board. So put the fair counterweight down beside him. The panel got the big thing right. Most of it is misidentification, and there was no evidence of a threat. But three things in that room have never sat right, and honesty requires we name them. 1. The Navy Photo Interpretation Laboratory, the people who actually measured the Tremonton film, said self-luminous, not birds, and the panel overruled them in an afternoon. The experts closest to the evidence were the ones the generalists talked past. 2. The panel began with a conclusion it had been convened to reach. The CIA wanted the panic reduced. The panel obliged. That is not the same as following the evidence wherever it leads. And 3. The recommendation to watch private citizens' clubs for subversive purposes is, whatever your view of sources, a genuinely chilling thing for a government science panel to put on paper. So weigh it the way we weigh everything. As evidence that aliens visited Earth, the Robertson Panel is worth nothing. It identified no object and found no hardware, and it never claimed otherwise. But as evidence that the United States government made a conscious decision to debunk, to ridicule, and to manage public belief about the sky, it is the strongest, most explicit document there is. The mystery in this file is not what was in the sky. It is what a frightened government decided to do about the people looking up. Before we file it, follow the thread out of the room, because a report is only a recommendation until something happens. And with the Robertson Panel, something happened almost immediately. The proof is the second document in our file, a CIA status memo, written 11 months later in December 1953 by an officer named Todos Odorenko. And it reports the result in one flat, extraordinary sentence.
The definite drop in the number of sightings reported during 1953 over 1952 could be attributed to actions following these recommendations.
The reports dropped, and the CIA, in its own internal memo, credits the drop to the panel, to the actions taken after January 1953. That is the debunking program, showing up in the statistics within a year, not because the sources went away, because the government had made it a little more embarrassing, a little more pointless, to report one. The same memo shows you the machinery winding down, Blue Book being handed off from the Intelligence Center to Air Defense Command, run now by a single officer and one airman, and a technical program to actually photograph and measure UFOs collapsing in almost comic fashion.
100 cameras were purchased with diffraction gratings to record the spectra of any object photographed. 90% of the gratings have gone bad, the grating separating from its mounting plate. The planned instrumentation effort in the Albuquerque area has now been dropped.
Read that against the debunking. At the very moment the government was working to convince the public there was nothing to see, its one serious effort to actually gather hard data, cameras that could have caught a spectrum, a measurement, a fact, was falling apart in a box, and the field study was quietly cancelled. Whatever you believe was in the sky, this is the true shape of it. The collection of evidence withered, while the management of belief accelerated, and the belief management did not stop with a memo. In the independent record, context now, not this file, the fingerprints of the Robertson Panel run for decades. Within months, In August 1953, the Air Force issued a regulation, 200-2, tightening how UFO reports were handled and restricting what the public was told. Captain Ruppelt, the one man who ran Blue Book and took it seriously, was gone by that same August, and Blue Book after him drifted toward a case-closing operation. And 15 years later, when the government wanted the whole subject finally put to bed, it commissioned a university study whose conclusion, that there was nothing worth studying, reads like the Robertson Panel's grandchild. The panel's report was 4 pages. Its shadow was 20 years long, and those 2 withheld documents, the 31 pages, still pulled from the folder. We will not pretend to know what is in them, and we will not let you believe it is a saucer, because everything around them in this very file says there was no saucer to hide. Far more likely, sources, methods, foreign liaison detail, the ordinary secrets of a 1953 intelligence agency. But we flag them plainly because the file is not complete, and an honest investigation tells you where the edges of its own knowledge are. So let us put it on the record, in order, the way the file earns it.
1947, the modern UFO era begins. Over the next 5 years, some 1,500 sightings are reported to the U.S. government. The 2nd of July, 1952, near Tremonton, Utah, Navy photographer Delbert Newhouse films roughly 1,600 frames of bright objects in daylight. July 1952, over 2 weekends, unidentified targets appear on radar over Washington, D.C. Jets are scrambled. The story runs nationwide.
The 13th of October, 1952, a CIA Office of Scientific Intelligence memo finds no conclusion that the sources are Soviet and warns it is far too early for psychological warfare planning. December 1952, on the recommendation of Dr. H. Marshall Chadwell, the CIA moves to convene a scientific panel.
The 14th through the 18th of January, 1953, the panel meets in Washington. Robertson, Alvarez, Berkner, Goudsmit, and Page, with Hynek and Durant. It reviews Blue Book, the Tremonton and Great Falls films, and the Air Force's projects. The 17th of January. The panel signs its report, no threat, strip the special status, train and debunk, watch the private groups.
The 26th of August, 1953, the Air Force issues Regulation 200-2, restricting UFO reporting. Captain Ruppelt has left Blue Book by that month. The 17th of December, 1953, a CIA memo credits the year's drop in sightings to the panel's recommendations.
The 7th of June, 1991, the report is declassified through the CIA's Historical Review Program. The 31st of July, 1997, a further National Archives declassification action. And in 2026, the folder is released again in the government's public UAP disclosure at war.gov. 31 pages still withheld inside it.
So, what do we actually know? We know this is a genuine CIA file, declassified decades ago, published for years, and released again in 2026. And we know its contents for certain, because we can read the unredacted pages. We know the CIA convened a panel of 5 eminent scientists in January 1953, in response to the 1952 sighting wave and the Washington radar scare. We know the panel found no threat, no foreign artifact, and no new physics. We know it recommended that the government strip UFOs of their special status and aura of mystery through a program its own record calls training and debunking, reaching on paper for Walt Disney and a panic psychologist. We know it recommended that civilian UFO groups be watched for possible subversive use, and we know from the CIA's own follow-up memo that reports dropped the next year, and the agency credited the panel for it. All of that we know, because the documents say it plainly. What we do not know is what was actually in the skies over Washington or over Tremonton, The Tremonton film is unexplained to this day, and the Navy's lab and the panel's scientists disagreed about it, on the record, and never resolved it. We do not know whether the recommendation to watch civilian groups was ever carried out. The file recommends it and does not record it, and we do not know what is on the 31 pages still withheld from the folder, though everything around them says it is not a hidden craft. This file is not proof of anything from beyond the Earth, and it never pretends to be. Its own chairman says there is no hardware. It is proof of something more unsettling and better documented, that the United States government, faced with a frightened public and a Cold War, made a deliberate decision to teach that public to stop looking up. Unresolved is not the same word as extraterrestrial, and a debunking campaign is not the same thing as a saucer in a hangar. In the end, the most revealing thing in this file is not what the scientists concluded. It is what they chose to do with the conclusion. They could have said simply, "Most of this is misidentification. There is no threat. Carry on." Instead, 5 of the finest minds in America signed their names to a plan to manage what their fellow citizens were allowed to wonder about, to strip the sky of its mystery on purpose for the public's own good. That is the quiet scandal of the Robertson Panel. Not aliens, a government deciding that curiosity itself was a security risk. So we will do the opposite of what they recommended. We will not debunk it, and we will not inflate it. We will file it exactly as it is. The Robertson Panel, January 1953. No craft, no bodies, no cover-up of a spaceship, a cover-up of contempt. A real declassified decision to make America laugh at its own sky. Real, recorded, and in every way that matters, still unresolved. Case file 015. The Debunking. Every page read, every claim checked against the record by an autonomous SAI investigation. The UAP Herald. Declassified. Investigated. Filed.